Well, good day, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our EDO sponsor appreciation presentation. My name is Jay Garner, and I'm serving as chair of the Site Selectors Guild for this year. It's a crazy time for all of us, but with adversity comes opportunity. We salute you, economic development professionals, knowing that you're on the front lines of helping to build your area's economy. Post-COVID, there will be opportunity, and we want to help you in any way we can in providing content that may help you moving forward. Unfortunately, we can't provide small business loans or grants. We can't serve as a conduit for PPP loans, but we can share with you our perspectives from our knowledge with our corporate clients. Over the last 3 years alone, the Guild has had over 70 sponsors for our annual conferences, our fall forums, and our advisory forums, which has allowed us to conduct our meetings to offer networking and thought leadership for our economic development partners. Today's presentation is our way to say thank you for what you do and your support of our efforts. I'm now going to turn it over to our president and CEO, Rick Weddle, who will serve as today's moderator.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you, Jay, for that introduction, and welcome to this afternoon's podcast. I'm Rick Weddle. I'm president and CEO of the Site Selectors Guild, and it's my pleasure today to be the moderator for this important webinar, Site Selection After COVID-19, Predictions from the Experts. And we have a great panel of experts for you today. Next slide. Next slide. First, as a bit of an introduction, let me kind of help you understand the importance of the Guild we see to the site selection business overall. In the past 3 years alone, Guild members have facilitated the job creation of over 165,000 new jobs and $90 billion in new capital investment. Today, the Guild remains and is one of the premier site selection organizations in the world. Next slide. Today we have on the agenda, we have an important set of presentations by a panel of board members and site selection professionals. We'll begin with Chris Lloyd of McGuire Woods Consulting, providing you with an overview, really high-level overview of a recent survey of Guild members completed just this last week on the impact of COVID-19. Following that, Michelle Comerford with Biggins Lacey Shapiro and Company will walk you through changes coming to the global supply chain. Greg Wasmansdorf will discuss corporate real estate and how space utilization will change during the period now and after COVID-19. But before we get started, let me give you a bit of do some housekeeping and a bit of instructions. You should have, as a participant, a control panel, a GoToWebinar control panel that about halfway down will have a question section. If you click there, you can enter a question that may arise or come up with you during the course of the presentations that you'd like for us to address during the Q&A period. So just type that question in. I'll be logging those and watching those, and my job will be to moderate a discussion among the panelists on those questions and others when we get to that section. So let's just jump right into it and get started. Let me introduce to you Chris Lloyd of McGuire Woods Consulting. Chris?
Great, thanks, Rick, and really appreciate the opportunity to be with everybody. First, I want to say thanks to Jay, our new chairman of the Guild, for his leadership in instituting this. You know, Jay thought it was really important, and the board did as well, that, you know, we really reach out to our sponsors, because but for y'all, our partners and our sponsors, you know, we as the Guild wouldn't be able to provide this sort of content. And we really wanted to say thank you and use this as an opportunity to let you know how much we appreciate you, our sponsors. And we also want you to know this is part of a series that we intend to do, that we want to, this is not just a one and done sort of opportunity. We want to use this opportunity to really connect with our partners in the economic development community. Much of what Jay said, just to share what we're hearing as site selectors, what we're hearing from other economic development organizations across the country. I know I know a lot of my colleagues on this call have also been participating in webinars and other events. So we're hearing the good and the bad of what other economic development organizations are doing. We're hearing what our clients are saying, and we really wanted to have the opportunity to share that with you. We'll start though with running through the survey that was done, and we'll go to the next slide to get that started. One of the things we want to make clear is, and one of the first questions I always get in a lot of these webinars is, with social distancing, is the era of site visits and fam tours and those kind of activities over? It certainly is not. This is a relationship-driven business, and I think it will remain that. And so it's very important for us to use this venue while we can't be with each other in person to connect with everybody. But at the end of the day, yes, there might be some shift to more virtual tours at the front end of the process, people using websites a little bit more. But at the end of the day, this is a relationship-driven business. And until you can touch it and feel it and smell it and get out on the site and shake someone's hand and see a community, site selection will, I think, remain that for a very, very long time. Next slide. We also know that everybody's very, very busy, and we want you to continue to stay in touch with us. We want to be able to talk to you as we're seeing opportunities, or if you just have questions. A lot of us, we're here to help. Don't feel intimidated. Reach out to your friends. That's the way we hope you look at us as your resources and friends, that you're going to reach out to us if you've got questions. So just bear with us as we kind of get through this webinar, but also know that we're here to be a resource. With that, we'll start walking through the survey a little bit. And as Rick noted, we did this survey about a week ago, and some of it does show you're going to see a week to 10 days ago, you're going to see some interesting issues because even the world has shifted within the past week. And I wouldn't be surprised if we took the poll now that there may be a slight change in the results. For example, we asked the members when they think activity is going to return. And as you see, it's very clear that the membership thought that we really weren't going to see activity return until the fourth quarter of this year or sometime into 2021. Now that you have certain states saying, actually, next week we may start to reopen with certain constraints and social distancing, maybe you might start some shift. I'm seeing it in some of our client base that, well, maybe third quarter isn't so dismal as we thought it would be. Whereas you've got other clients saying, oh no, until we have a vaccine, we're not going to do anything until 2021. So I think you would see some shift there. But again, you're not seeing a whole lot of activity with regards to site visits, certainly now, but I think you are going to see it pick up relatively quickly back in the third quarter and then certainly into the fourth quarter. Next slide. When we asked our colleagues in the Site Selectors Guild where they thought which industries were going to be hottest in this sector, it should be no surprise to everybody that life sciences, logistics, and advanced manufacturing are going to be hot in the post-COVID world. Life sciences we've got 90% of our base pharmaceuticals are made overseas now, and that something's going to change with regards to that. We're moving a little. If we can back up the slides a little bit, and then logistics and advanced manufacturing. Actually, there we go. All right, sorry about that. Life science, you're going to see some of that shift. Logistics and advanced manufacturing are going to be hot. And a lot of that is because, again, there were trends that were already taking place in the marketplace with regards to e-commerce and advanced manufacturing, artificial intelligence and automation, which were already hot, which are going to continue to be only augmented in this environment, and then life sciences being as an emerging opportunity. Next slide. So when we took the survey, there were two issues that came up that really bubbled up to the top, which is why we have Michelle and Greg with us. The first one is de-risking the supply chain. How is this going to make cause for shifts in the global distribution network? What are we going to see with regards to whether you're a high-cost producer, low-cost producer? How are things going to shift? And we'll get into a little bit more detail there. So again, we don't want you to think we picked these topics just randomly. It was what we were hearing from our survey showed that people were very interested and saw opportunities in supply chain. Next. And some of those opportunities in supply chain, you'll see, when you looked at what the responses showed from our survey, a lot of people really do feel that this is going to result in a major shakeup of supply chain strategies. And so that's why we have Michelle speaking. Next slide. You'll see here some of the questions, and Michelle, I'm sure, will go into much more detail on this in her presentation, but the opportunities for reshoring in America, diversification across Asia with regards to where supply chain is going to be. Again, continuing to look at, is it going to just be cost, or what about reduction of risk? And I'm sure Michelle will review that in her presentation. Next slide. But we also said, and a lot of people are going, well, what's the new office going to look like? Now that we're all working from home, are we, when the restrictions come off, are we all going to race back into the office? What are our plans and then hug each other, or maybe at least wave to each other 6 feet apart? Or are we going to be, this work from home thing is actually not that bad? And so how does that shake up the office environment? And that's why we have Greg talking. So let's look at the survey results from there. Again, you'll see that when those Site Selectors Guild members were surveyed, not as strong as supply chain, but still a lot of the site selectors feel that this incidence is going to have a big impact on the office environment, the use of remote workers, or just even companies having policies on what a work from home structure looks like. I think a lot of companies were caught flat-footed and didn't know how to react with this. Next slide. And that's what Greg's going to talk about in his presentation. So with that, we really welcome, again, the opportunity to talk with y'all today. Really look forward to the questions. I really do think, before I close this out, this is an opportunity for the economic development community to shine. There's been a lot of attacks on economic development, during the past few years, from the political left and the political right. And now's the time for, I think, the economic development profession to really step up and show that we are a full partner with our communities, our full partner with our businesses, and really help guide them to, I think, what's going to be a brighter future once we come through this. And with that, Rick, we'll turn it back to you to get Michelle started. Thanks.
Okay, Michelle, take it away. Michelle, we're not able to hear you.
Thank you. That's part of the joys of the new technology. Thank you, Rick. I will start over, and thank you again, and thank Chris for the introductions, and thank the economic development sponsors for your support of the Guild, and thank you for joining us today. As Chris teed up my topic, I'm going to cover some of the changes that we foresee coming to the global supply chains and strategies for manufacturers. So unless you've been living under a rock, and no judgment if that's your best way to deal with quarantine, you likely have heard about, or at least read about, a lot of this supply chain disruption that's occurred as a result of coronavirus. And you'll see here some of those examples of headlines that really illustrate how this issue has come to light. Those disruptions have been occurring both on the supply side, even dating back to the first part of the year when Asia started to shut down to prevent the spread of the virus. That started to disrupt the flow of goods to the US and to other countries. And then also on the demand side, as things started to shut down in the US, for example, and other countries, that increased demand for different types of products virtually overnight, or much more of them. So the toilet paper example, food, different household items, home fitness gear, and that sort of thing. That also disrupted the supply chain in that demand became much greater than manufacturers were really planning for and putting out. And so all of those things really combined are giving a lot of manufacturers some pause to think about, how should we structure our strategy going forward? Next slide. So some of this trend and sort of rethinking those strategies is certainly not a new thing. This slide actually is one that I've been using for 6 or 7 years now in talking about some of the reshoring strategies, or just first time into the US strategies. And some of the reasons behind that is that for a period of time, Asia, as they have improved their quality of life and had so much success with manufacturing there, the wages have started to go up. As so much product was traveling, the transportation costs were going up. And so some of those cost advantages for some industries and some companies were starting to decrease. Combine that with some other disruptions that have happened over the past couple of decades, things like weather events, tariffs, trade wars, port strikes, and things like that. So we've had other disruptions over the course of time. But of course, the coronavirus disruption has been unprecedented and is going to likely cause a major rethinking and relooking at strategies. Another reason for this trend previously has been our advances in manufacturing, automation, robotics, and production layouts that are less reliant on low-cost manual labor, which is what a lot of companies were chasing, 30 years ago when they went to Asia. And so again, I'll emphasize some companies and some industry sectors, we're already looking at that. There's a lot of benefit to making your products closer to where they will be consumed. So kind of the local for local strategy. You can react faster to changing consumer preferences. You can speed development of new products, and you're less risk averse overall when you're not depending on things to get halfway across the world to meet your customer orders. And so some of that was certainly already happening. Now, given this major disruption globally, I think we'll certainly see an accelerated strategizing plan to move more production closer to the markets to where they'll be consumed. So in a lot of cases, that doesn't mean they're going to totally pull out of Asia. They may stay there and serve that market because that has been a growing consumer market in its own right. And so we're talking about more the portion of that production that is destined for the US or destined for North America or destined for Europe. Those operations moving closer to those areas. Next slide. So some of the changing strategies that we're likely to see, I mentioned the local for local strategy, kind of more regionalized manufacturing strategy, whether that be within a country or within an area just closer again to where those products will be consumed. That will also likely mean some smaller plants. So rather than one mega plant to serve the world, you're talking about a number of smaller plants placed in different locations. Combined with that are really looking at some of those strategic commodities, having those closer to home, the pharmaceuticals, the healthcare products, all of this PPE that we're also hearing so much about. Part of our challenge in the US of the shortages has been that we were relying on those products to come from Asia and from other parts of the world. And so we were having difficulty getting those things. And we realized in such a critical time how important that is to be able to have access to those things faster and control that and overall minimize our risk exposure. And that will be an interesting thing to watch, how the government might support or put some programs out, even at the federal level, to help support and accelerate some of that investment faster. I talked about the increased automation that has allowed companies to start to think about making products in the US. I think we'll see even greater acceleration of those processes. And frankly, we're lucky that we're at this point in time where we have a lot of this technology and so much production, artificial intelligence advances that we can look at this and hopefully implement some of this stuff faster. It'll be interesting to see how things sort of play out on a short-term versus a long-term basis. Obviously, it takes some time to get a manufacturing plant built or retrofitted and up and running. And so there might be some in-between steps there. Likely, one of the short-term things will be increased inventory. So for companies that are currently sourcing from overseas, rather than having this just-in-time model where they just get enough that they need to deliver to their customers within that month or whatever, seeing more of that safety stock increase so that the inventory levels are there should we have to shut down again. So we might see a run on warehouse space likely in the near term. Next slide. So what can you do as economic developers in your communities to prepare? Some of these things are going to sound a little familiar, I'll be honest. First of all, workforce training. I talked about the automation, the increased focus on that. We've been talking about that with you for years, as you know, but now basically multiply that by 100, see much more investment in this area. And so that's going to be an even greater demand for those skilled workers, as electricians, as maintenance mechanics, people that can operate and maintain and retool that important production equipment. So we're going to have even more focus on what community college training programs are out there and support programs for that pipeline of labor. Secondly, again, ready to go sites and buildings, another topic we've been preaching about. But now if you think about this accelerated trend of companies wanting to restructure their networks fast, a lot of them are going to be looking for existing buildings or places that they can get up and running quickly. And so even more of an emphasis on having those properties ready to go, why that will be so critical. Thirdly, even with this increased consideration of risk avoidance in their business case, it still has to, the dollars and cents still have to make some sense. They are likely to consider paying a little bit more to be closer to a market and pay more in wages, that sort of thing, to minimize that risk exposure. But there'll still be those boardroom decisions about capital investment. So the ability for communities and states to have those flexible support programs to meet those gaps where they need them will become important, just as it has been. But we'll continue to look at that. One new thing that I think will be really interesting to follow, and where some of the local EDOs can really fill in. One of the things that has stalled the reshoring movement to date has been a lack of local suppliers for some of the products. So, for example, if a company decided, there have been TV companies, for example, or bike manufacturers that have come to the U.S., we're going to make our product in the U.S. Well, that supply chain for those parts still lies overseas. And so they still were relying on those imports to make those products, because we just didn't have that supply chain, for example, in the U.S. So going forward, I think one thing that's been really interesting are all of the innovation that's coming out of local U.S. manufacturers. A lot of the 3D printing companies, plastics companies, metals companies who have retooled their lines very quickly to make the essential equipment. If they could do that so quickly, what might that open their eyes to for making other kinds of parts and supplies that are required in filling those supply chain gaps? And so I think you can look internally into your communities, into your states, at some of these examples and what these companies are doing, and perhaps look forward to how can we help fill these gaps as more companies come to the U.S., restructuring their supply chain and looking for those suppliers. So there's a connection link there, opportunity for you. So with that, and I know we're going to take questions at the end, I'm now going to turn over to Greg Wassensdorf to talk about corporate real estate space utilization.
Thanks, Michelle. Great to be here. Great to participate in this. I think I've got both of my mute buttons released. There's a bit of overlap between what Michelle was just saying on the supply chain side of things and what I'm going to talk about primarily in the office sector, office occupancy. So let's get right into that. One of those key things is that trends that were already in motion have now been accelerated. So COVID is a catalyst, an accelerator of things that were already happening. There was already some discontent with existing office models, office occupancy models, and of course with stay at home, the traditional model for some people in some places has been completely disrupted. The question is, what's going to happen next? The challenge at this point is that it's a little too soon to know that corporate real estate or CRE solutions are only beginning to emerge. It's too soon to know. We're starting to get a glimpse of what both tenants and landlords are doing with their office space. But right now, with most people working from home, landlords are trying to anticipate what the environment's going to be like when people come back to work and plan accordingly. So I want to talk about 4 things in particular, what Newmark has been identifying as key changes to both business operations and corporate real estate, and I'll move through them as follows. First of all, talking about new hygiene protocols in the workplace. Of course, remote working, because that's what a lot of people are doing now. Physical distancing once you do return to work, and what does this mean for business continuity planning? So what I'm going to show are just some glimpses of some work, some research that Newmark's been doing, and things that have been published recently. If we can go to the next slide, I'll just give you a sort of a layout of what is to come, because it's going to be very text heavy, and you're going to have these slides when we're all done. So I'm not going to try to read the content. I'm going to highlight a few things, but as we go through the next 4 slides, you're going to see on the left-hand side the change element that we're going to discuss, and that's in the red circle over in the left-hand column. Then within the 2x2, there's a vertical and a horizontal axis. On the left-hand side, we're thinking about corporate real estate now in terms of human behavior and policy that supports the changing ways in which people will want and need to work in their workspace. And at the top part of the chart is what's happening immediately, let's say within the first year. So still within the crisis and in the immediate response to the crisis, what happens to human behavior and policy? And then what happens beyond as we move down the table to beyond a year, maybe 2 years, 3 years from now? What does it begin to look like? On the right-hand side of the table, we start to talk then about the physical space and the infrastructure of corporate real estate. Again, what's happening immediately in the physical space, and then over the longer term in the bottom right-hand quadrant, how does the physical space and infrastructure of the office portfolio or the office environment need to change? So with that orientation, let me do a quick walkthrough on these 4 major change elements. The first one being new hygiene protocols. So, I think a lot of people would agree that even before COVID-19, poor working conditions in office environments were a problem. And they were certainly the top complaints that facilities managers and landlords were receiving, right? The air quality was poor, the ventilation was poor, why can't we open our windows, we can't control the temperature, all of these things, in addition to cleanliness issues. So what does it mean now that we're in the era of COVID? Well, it's sometimes little things and sometimes it's big things. I mean, initially, right, you can expect even those companies that had not moved toward a clean desk policy where you can't have your family photographs and your personal memorabilia and your stuffies and all of these other things that you like to have in your workplace, you may be asked to take that all away so that cleaning staff can now more efficiently come through the work environment and clean horizontal surfaces, clean people's desks, the tops of cubicles, and those sorts of things. So don't be surprised if the facilities manager, your own office facilities manager, or a landlord comes in and says, I need everything off the desks. Clean desk policy, we need to be more efficient and more frequent in our cleaning. What does that look like then when you move forward, beyond, sort of the emergency response? We start to see more deeper changes to the way business then operates. The first item on the list there, more paid sick days. I mean, human policy, right, workplace policy might change, but in the physical workspace, enhanced digitization to remove the physical manual labor within the office. This was already being looked at and implemented by a lot of companies. The digitization of business processes, that could be accelerated. Within the physical space and the infrastructure, on the right-hand side, immediately we start to see, if we could advance, please, we can see that in some workspaces, removable panels are already being installed on reception desks, in workstations, but that's the quick solution. Over the longer term, landlords and occupiers of office space will start to look at deeper technology solutions, touchless technologies, and other technologies. So now you go to fill a water bottle at a sink or at a water bottle station, that water bottle station may now have antiviral, microbial technology built in. We'll see. But so you can get the sense here now. We're looking at short-term fixes, longer-term fixes. Next slide. When we move on to remote working, as so many people are doing right now, the pandemic obviously forcing people to move home to work. Many are working at home for the very first time. The consultants on this call and other guild members, we're used to working on airplanes and hotels and in the back seats of cars and at home. A lot of people are not used to that. One thing that we would call out is that, as it says in the bottom left-hand corner, leadership of companies should not form strong opinions about alternative workplace strategies and work from home strategies based on current conditions, because a lot of companies just weren't planning for it and prepared for it. But if over time, we might see that we migrate from, sort of a scrambling to get technology into people's hands and trying to quickly train people on what distributed team best practices are. If that becomes a little bit more of the norm for companies, we then start to talk about connected culture programs. And what does it mean when people are mobile, people hot desk when they do come into the office? And a lot of companies have been doing that for years, but many companies have not done that at all. Again, in the physical space, on the right-hand side of the ledger, certainly we see remote working changing the way that spaces are occupied when people do come into the office, and they are required to share space when they arrive. But then in the longer term, this is what's going to be interesting to figure out, is will there be less space allocated to individual desks and offices or more? Initially, you might think people will say, I don't want to be commingling with people. I need my own space. But the response might be, no, actually, we kind of like that people are working from home. We're going to require more work from home. And when you do come into the office, you will share space more than ever before. We'll just do our absolute best to make sure that it's clean. Every company is going to have to approach that balancing act in its own way, in its own time. And I'll talk about that more in a moment. Next slide. So physical distancing, we're all practicing that today. And what we'll see in the office is going to require some evolution. Right away, we're seeing occupancy limits in certain workspaces, physical distancing signage throughout. That part's easy. But what we've started to do, at Newmark is look at what we call the risk overlay within an office environment. So what does it mean to have high risk areas, low risk and medium risk areas, and intersections where people will physically be bumping into one another through the office environment? That can be planned for, but it'll take time. So Rachel, if we could advance a couple of items here, we can highlight just a few things. Internal mobility planning will become key. When Newmark in our workplace strategy group right now is looking at what happens when we remove workstations or just keep the workstations where they are, particularly people seating, and now sacrifice conference rooms to create new office environments as a quick solution. But that's only a tide me over type of solution. We're going to have to figure out over time, business by business, office by office, what does that mean, and how do we compartmentalize people, and how do we reduce risk in the workplace through different workplace strategies. Next slide. So with respect to business continuity, we know that companies, the whole discipline of enterprise risk management, or ERM, has advanced a lot over the last 10 years. And in our own survey of companies, we've noticed that the response to the question, do you have a well-developed enterprise risk management protocol and strategy, And did that work for you, even in the case of this remarkable COVID situation? Fewer than a third of businesses said, yes, we have a plan and we were ready for something like this. More than 2/3 said, we did not really anticipate anything like this. So the business continuity planning discipline will have to continue to evolve. This decentralized work model that we have now, that people are experimenting with, is going to have to get formalized. And companies will have to make some really hard decisions about whether or not, for example, they continue to keep one major headquarters, or do they split up headquarters functions into multiple locations, as an example. And with the physical infrastructure, again, advancing again to the right side of this chart, it means, adopting new cloud technologies so that people can be more effective than they probably are now, working from home, struggling with their own home internet systems, and significant investment in building infrastructure improvements so that people are more mobile, have access to all of the tools and technologies that they need to be as productive, not just in the office, but anywhere that they decide to move within the office environment or move off-site and go home again. So these are all things that are being looked at and examined. So if we go to the next slide, please. What's clear is that workplace attitudes, behaviors, and the governance of that will continue to shift over time. Governance, right, is by companies with their own policies, but also landlords and facilities managers who dictate how people will be allowed to enter and exit and occupy within the physical structure. And corporate real estate strategies are going to have to address both the inside and the outside of this overall office strategy. The inside is how. How do you design the physical space to make it safe, to make it comfortable, to accommodate people's needs and fears, and the technology deployment therein, and respond to the behavioral norms that are going to continue to evolve. But outside the office, there's this bigger question, and this is where site selectors get directly involved again with economic development. The outside the box is, where will the office be? Which metropolitan areas will we occupy? And what will our preferences be? Some companies may question the big, megalopolis, urban environment and decide it's time to get away from the big city. They may question the idea of being downtown and having people on mass public transit and wanting to move out to suburbs or exurbs. And of course, are you going to be in the office or working remotely? These are all questions that will have to be contemplated going forward. What we do believe is that companies that don't sit back and just watch, but actively try to pilot and test and adapt with different solutions and experiment are probably going to be quicker to come up with a model that works effectively for them and be better positioned for success going forward. The last thing I'd like to just point out as a resource to everybody, if we go to the next slide, if you go to the Newmark website, ngkf.com/COVID-19, there's a COVID perspectives website. There's a lot of material on there that you can read. There are things that you can download, resources that are available to you. We've put that out there to support our clients and our friends in industry. So this whole idea of the risk overlay and the way that we are looking at tenant reboarding of offices, strategies, they're there for the taking, there for the download. So you're welcome to it. Thank you.
Well, thanks to our panel, I feel a little bit like we've all been drinking from a fire hydrant here. We've certainly had a lot of content and a lot of provocative, if you will, commentary. Let's just jump right into it. We have a number of questions that are kind of hot on the minds of everybody. One of the first one that comes up is, and let me just kind of repeat this, make sure I get it right. Will the federal government create incentives to support the reshoring of manufacturing and commodities to the U.S., and what would those incentives look like? So let's round and around we go. Let's start with Chris. I'll give you the first bite of that apple. What about federal incentives for reshoring?
I think it's a possibility. I don't think it's in the, I think as we've been speaking, it looks like a deal has been struck in Congress for a fourth stimulus package. At least what I've seen, I don't see anything in it yet for those sort of incentives, but I think there's a possibility. And I just don't know. I think it's a possibility that it could be there. And the thing you've got though is you got to make sure you're very careful with incentives when you're talking about federal incentives. Remember, we were already dealing with a number of challenges from Airbus and Boeing regarding their challenges, and you know, in the World Trade Organization and other things. So depending on how they're structured, they could be problematic. So something to watch for.
So let's have a follow-up on that from the rest of our panelists, because obviously, Chris, I think you started your comment by saying too soon to tell on some of these things, and that may be true for federal incentives. But for anyone, Jay or Greg or Michelle, what about regions or states or communities that you might see playing into the discussion of a special incentive that might be to help companies either reshore or come back? Jay, do you want to take a bite of that apple?
Sure. So let me also build on what Chris said. In late March, Senators Blackburn from Tennessee and Menendez from New Jersey authored a bipartisan bill that is focused on, I don't have the official name of it, but basically it's a Made in America supply chain bill, but it doesn't have really the particulars as it relates to the incentives. I think based on bipartisan discussion, that's going to absolutely come down the pike, because it seems like this might be the one thing where it garners bipartisan components. Also, rest assured, there will be, because I'm seeing it now, some states that will offer some form of state program to enhance that supply chain redevelopment. So it could be onshoring or reshoring. There's a difference between the two, but any kind of supply chain regionalization, though, I think it's important to point out, does not necessarily mean it's going to happen in the United States. It's going to happen in North America, which means it's going to be in the USMCA territory of Mexico, the US, or Canada, and avail themselves of those trade agreements.
Greg, you're the Canadian in the group. Do you have a similar or different view on that?
Yeah, I'm the schizophrenic dual citizen who lives a binational existence. Well, the thing that I said to our team internally here when this came up, the conversation was really sparked with some news that Japan was going to pay for companies to come out of China and return to Japan. And there was a sense that there was a bit of a bandwagon effect happening, and that trend was going to grow, and that countries absolutely should just start paying their firms to come home. And I said, let's be cautious. And like Michelle said, like I was saying, you know, trends that were in place before are likely to get augmented and accelerated or magnified now post-COVID. We were already in a trend, not just people are talking about de-globalization. I think it's overstated a lot of the time, but we were certainly in a moment where the White House, being the biggest voice against a lot of multilateral institutions, against a lot of multilateral action, I think there is a sense that the time is now, right, to say America first and pay for companies to come home. The problem with that is we've spent nearly 40 years putting in place, as Chris said, World Trade Organization and multilateral investment agreements and trade agreements that prohibit countries from just buying business from one another, buying deals. There are rules in place about that. And so I think it's easy to kind of forget that there is still a global international order for the way business is meant to be done. And we've got to be cautious about how quickly we try to jump on bandwagons like that.
Interesting. Michelle, let me switch to you just okay, go right ahead.
Yep, sorry, just two quick things so we can move on to another question. So one, I think too soon to tell for sure. Two, Larry Kudlow did make a statement about potentially, you know, for supporting reshoring at the federal level. I think the format was depreciation within the first year of the building. And so that would be something that would be kind of new. Now it would depend on if a company didn't have that kind of tax obligation, of how applicable that would be, but maybe that could be refundable. I mean, all of those things, we don't know yet. No one knows. But those are potential. I think where we might see potentially, again, at the federal level, some of that support could be in those critical, essential industries, the pharmaceuticals, the medical supplies, the things that we've really struggled and needed to combat this pandemic. I think that has cast a shining light on our gap in those industries and having access to those locally. So I could see potentially a federal level support program, remains to be seen what it looks like, but to encourage and help accelerate those investments into the U.S.
Michelle,
Okay, thank you, Michelle.
I think you nailed it there, because we've been in a habit of thinking of mission critical industries, strategic industries being, you know, military, aerospace, things like that. We haven't thought of, you know, N95 masks as being strategic. So it's going to change our view on industrial policy.
That's a good point, Greg. Let me go back to Michelle and take you a little deeper, Michelle. In your supply chain conversation, you talked about regionalization of manufacturing strategy, and you said it maybe a trend to smaller plants. Question is from the crowd is, what do you mean by smaller plants? And would that mean an opportunity for smaller communities?
Well, it certainly could. In my slide, what I meant specifically was for those companies that have taken the strategy of we're going to have 1 or 2 mega plants serving the whole globe. We're just going to make everything in China, for example, out of a 2 million square foot manufacturing plant. So sort of breaking that up. And so it doesn't mean that 2 million square feet for one company would come to the U.S. Whatever portion of that was making the products for the U.S. might come to the U.S. So then you might be looking at a 500,000 square foot plant or something like that. So that's one example. So just kind of instead of a mega plant serving the whole globe, smaller, more regional serving. When I say regional, you know, country basis or continent basis, just closer, less transit time kind of operation. As far as for smaller communities, there's always that, you know, opportunity. I think it really depends on the workforce and having those types of skilled workers that we keep hammering about and having access to those.
Okay, thank you, Michelle. Jay, let me switch gears with you a second. I'd like to hear this from all the panelists, but let's start with you. From an EDO perspective, how should I, as an economic developer, stay in touch with you as a site selector during this next few months or next year?
I think everyone's being creative now as it relates to reaching out to all of us virtually. So we're all being bombarded with emails. There's a lot of those emails who really aren't meant for the site location professional. They're meant more internally, but we happen to be on their distribution list, so we're getting them. I would encourage our economic development partners to manage that list judiciously so that you don't get people to start to unsubscribe you. All of us who are on this call today have participated in a voluminous number of Zoom presentations. We're hearing from our economic development partners often because they want to reach out. We're participating in these Zoom presentations or podcasts. But a lot of the ED groups are trying to reach out to all of us strategically until we're able to see each other personally. Last point on that, to what Chris said earlier, we're still in a relationship business. We'll always be in a relationship business. We've pivoted as a result of a shelter-in-place environment that we're living in, but everyone is yearning to be able to talk to people personally, in person once again, and there is not ever going to be a substitute for that.
Someone else want to take a bite of that one?
I'll just say I agree. We are actually this week planning a virtual community tour, or at least an introduction meeting for a project. And so we're not quite at the point where we're going to ask them to do some drone videos of the sites, but that could be coming pretty soon. Our client project wants to keep moving forward, and so we've got to keep advancing the ball. And so we're looking for those creative ways to help us do that.
Rick, the only thing I would add is going back to the comment I made at the beginning, pick up the phone and call. You know, we're here to be a resource. We're here to be an asset. We're here to answer questions. We're here to be a shoulder to cry on. Heck, we might need a shoulder to cry on once in a while too, you know? And so, you know, this is the time to maintain those relationships, and, you know, and it should go both ways. And I hope that everybody feels that way.
Yeah, good point. Greg, I want to switch to you for a follow-up. You took us kind of analytically through some of these real estate facility situations, but one of your slides talked about how and where, you know, the inside and outside, you know, but it strikes me that there's going to be, in the post-COVID-19 timeframe, there may be some winners and some losers in terms of how things get realigned. Do you care to venture into how will you, what will it take to be a winner? It's maybe instead of picking a winner and a loser for me, what will it take to be a winner and avoid being a loser post COVID-19? No pressure. No pressure right there. No.
Rick, do you want to talk to my legal department before I try answering that question? I honestly don't know how to answer that question right now.
Okay.
I really don't, because the gainers, the losers in this scenario, right? We're going to have to look at it at all scales, at all geographic scales, and I mean down to the office level, right? Down to the block level, where we see restaurants that close. But can a restaurant get retooled as a new office environment? Where landlords may, in some cases, you know, lose their portfolio because they can't support their debt. Yet some of them are going to do just great because they continue to support their occupier tenants very, very effectively. And we see, you know, in the discussions that we're having with our tenant and landlord occupiers, just keeping the real estate focus for the moment, that, you know, that there are still deals being done, that in some cases landlords and tenants are working together very amicably toward deals that are supportive of each other's business, right? And so it's a kind of a win-win scenario. How that scales out to the national level, you know, it's too soon to know. It's too soon to know how individual companies are going to make those decisions about, you know, whether they stay in New York or whether they double down on places like New York. And of course, New York's had a tough time. Other cities have too, but only time will tell.
When do you, do any of you think you'll see clients asking you to get back on the road whenever everything is opened up? Will that start immediately thereafter, or will it be a kind of a slow burn there?
I think it's going to depend on the nature of the project. Oh, go ahead, Michelle.
No, I agree. I was just going to say it's tough to tell, and it's also going to be difficult given the different levels of phasing back up that each state is going to be faced with. And so it's not like a blanket, like, okay, you can travel anywhere now. I mean, there's going to be different parts of the country where you still can't go for a period of time. So I think it's going to be very dependent on the company and the project and where. We'll have to wait and see.
Yeah,
We have I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Jay.
I was just gonna say, I think I'm already seeing pressure for June.
So we have we've scheduled, and I'm sure we might be a little ambitious with this, but the client and us and one of the communities that we need to visit is scheduled for May 19th. So I have not bought an airline ticket yet, but that is our intent if all goes as we hope it will.
Good. Let me. We started out our Q&A on the federal incentive question. Let me kind of close out the Q&A and talk a little bit. You know, I expect that probably a lot of our EDO partners are going to be facing municipal budget issues, lots of state issues, lots of municipal budget issues. Anyone just care to comment about the politics of a company asking for financial incentive support at a time in which our cities are going to be kind of on the ropes for a while? So I know that's another third rail to talk about, but that's one of the topics that comes up in our Q&A questions. That's a tough one.
Yeah, it's gonna. I mean, states and municipalities, bottom line, are going to be drained fiscally. State of Georgia yesterday, where I happen to live, announced that they're anticipating a $4 billion state budget deficit, and so they're talking about for state employees furloughs and layoffs that should last about an 18-month period based on their economic modeling. There will be lots of states who will be in that. I think any kind of request for public assistance as it relates to incentives, whether it's statutory or discretionary, is going to be challenging.
Rick, the only thing that I would add is that I think this does accelerate the trend, which we're already seeing, and I think many of us supported, that is for post-performance incentives. And that if we can talk about that, you know, the company's going to perform first, it's going to pay money into the state or the community, and it's not going to see the benefit for a few more years. And that's explained to the public. Yeah, I think there's going to be more criticism or more questions about that than there has been in the past, just the fact that the companies are asking for assistance. But, you know, I think the more that we can pivot towards these post-performance and talk about, you know, again, the state or the locality is always in the net positive, it's going to be an easier pill to swallow.
Mm-hmm. And of course, doesn't it follow that with going from a 3.5% unemployment rate to a 5, a 10, a 15, a 20, who knows where the ceiling is on this unemployment rate, that job creation is going to be an immensely powerful inducement, you know, once we get to next spring or so in that, that I think when people really settle into this. Anyone want to comment on that? I think jobs going to be popular again, right?
You're right.
Well, yeah, I agree. And that's also another reason, you know, there's the argument that some of that unemployment will go back to work when things open. But for those companies that do fold, and some of these local restaurants and things like that, that's, again, to get on my workforce soapbox, you know, an opportunity to get those folks retrained for some of the other new future opportunities that could be presented to your communities.
Yeah. Well, look, I'm looking at the clock.
If I could,
yes, Greg.
I'm sorry, to build on Michelle's comment, you know, around workforce, you know, not unlike the 2009-10, you know, deep recession where people fell out of the workforce. It's going to take a while for people to figure out what the new numbers actually mean. Not only what the new numbers are, but what the new numbers mean. Because yeah, the unemployment rate will be high. It will rise quickly. It will fall pretty quickly as well. But who is actually going to leave the labor force, maybe on a permanent basis now? We'll see. It's going to be tough to figure out.
That's interesting. You know, we've set aside a half hour or so for Q&A. I got a feeling that we could keep on this for the next hour and a half or two and keep going on, but that's really all the time we have today. I want to thank Chris and Michelle and Greg and Jay for being a wonderful panel in today's webinar. I'm Rick Weddle. I'm president of the Site Selectors Guild. I'm going to hand it back to Jay to wrap up.
Thank you, Rick, and we understand the hour is coming to an end. I also want to thank all of the participants who called in today and listened, and we hope it's been helpful to you. Rick, you've done a magnificent job as the moderator. I am always so proud of my fellow board members. So Chris, Michelle, and Greg are all board members. I learn from my guild members every day. Today is no exception. They did a magnificent job on presenting some true thought content. I would be remiss if I did not thank our two guild service providers, both DCI, who helped us produce this event today, and the Angela Rogers Group. So with that, I want to thank again our sponsors. We can't provide our thought content without your support, and this is just our way of saying we appreciate all you do. So on behalf of the Guild, thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.